Welcome back to Part 1B of our presentation, the use of guideline public firms to determine private firm enterprise value. In Part 1B, we continue to look at the theory, a quantitative approach to adjusting public firm multiples, presented by Dr. Stan Feldman.
So we're just keeping that to the side for the moment, but assume no discounts for liquidity. The two firms should be selling for the same price. But guess what? It's the rare case when the private firm is a clone of the guideline public company. So the issue then becomes, if we're using the guideline public company multiples to make valuation estimates, if you will, for the private firm, and they're not clones, then the law of one price described earlier is not really operational. Then what does an appraiser do? Or what does an investment professional do? Well, what they do is they make adjustments to bring the public company guideline multiple more consistent with the private company to be valued. Now remember that these guideline companies share several things in common with the private firm, but there are many things it doesn't share. So for an example, the private firm may be a regional producer of a product, and the guideline company may be a global producer. Guideline company may have many lines of business, or many product lines, I should say, similar to the private company's one or two products, but the breadth of the public company is far larger than the breadth of the private firm. So they are similar, but they're not clones. So the issue is, how do you make adjustments? Now, based on our experience, the adjustments made by most appraisers tend to be subjective. Now, this conclusion is based on, one, just reviewing a good deal of work done by others, and understanding that there often are, or at least for in many cases, constraints on what actually you can do based on the information that you have. But typically what happens is that an appraiser having guideline multiples, guideline public company multiples, will say something like, or will conclude something like, well, the private company should be selling at a lower multiple than the guideline public companies. Company 5, Guideline Company 5 is a small company selling at a lower multiple than the larger company. So let's use that as kind of the metric to value the private firm. But what this all comes down to is a subjective judgment. It's professional judgment for sure, but nevertheless a subjective judgment about what the multiple should be based on understanding or knowing and calculating what the guideline public company multiples are. Now, if you put an investment banker, M&A person, and a standard appraiser in a room, and you asked them, and you gave them a set of guideline firms, and you said, here's company X, what would be the value of company X based on the guideline firms? I'm guessing that there'd be a wide range of values associated with this exercise, and so the question becomes, if subjectivity is the basis of making an adjustment, that tends to be idiosyncratic, and if it turns out that the participants, market participants that might actually buy the company in question, that if their subjective view of the world is different than the subjective view of the world of the appraiser or the M&A professional, etc., then the values will be very much different. So the central issue is, how do we go ahead and make adjustments, but ensure that the adjustments are based on not being subjective, and based on quantitative information. Now, there is a standard operating principle in valuation, which basically states that whatever adjustments you do make, there should be some quantitative reason for making it. If you look at Revenue Ruling 5960, if you look at any of the fair value guidelines, any kind of adjustments that are being made, there should be some quantitative evidence suggesting that the adjustments are appropriate. Now, what we will show in the next couple of slides is how to make these adjustments, but make it on a quantitative, not a qualitative or subjective basis. The three most common multiples used in valuation are the revenue multiple, enterprise value to latest 12-month revenue, enterprise value to EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation in the last 12 months, and equity value to net income. Now, which of these multiples are used actually in practice really depends on the industry that the firm operates in, number one. And number two, how do market participants in that industry, how do they value the companies in their industry? What's the general metrics that are being used? For service businesses, it often is the revenue multiple. In light manufacturing businesses, it's often the EBITDA multiple. But nevertheless, it's important to know what actual practitioners, market participants, individuals, entities buying and selling, what they use as their measure. Because in the end, fair market value or fair value is going to be a function of how market participants actually view a private firm. And if market participants are looking at the private firm's EBITDA, for an example, as the as a key metric, then we certainly in the valuation industry should be using that as a key driver for our conclusion of value. Now, why would using public company multiples directly, that is unadjusted, result in a conclusion of value that's incorrect as it relates to the private company? As I said earlier, in general, using public company multiples directly, no adjustments, applying it directly to the private firm, whether it's done using a multiple that you select from the guideline companies for a variety of reasons, or you're using some average in process, whether it's the average or median, the likelihood is that the value emanating from the application of that multiple to the private firm will result in a value of the private firm that is just too high. Now, why is this the case? And in order to consider this, you have to consider what the determinants of the multiple happen to be. So first, there are three determinants for any multiple. The cost of capital, what investors require in terms of rate of return, the profit margins of a business, and the expected growth rate of earnings, however defined, whether it's EBITDA, whether it's net operating profits after tax, which we refer to as NOPAT. It really doesn't make a difference. Usually, typically, the private firm has characteristics, namely cost of capital, profit margin, and earnings growth that are different than the guideline firms. And in some cases, there are vast differences, very, very significant differences. And therefore, to directly use a public company multiple to value a private firm is likely to create a biased estimate of value. So what are these factors? What are the determinants of the multiple, of any multiple? First, it's the cost of capital. Now just think about this for a second. This is a small private company who's got a cost of capital that's twice the cost of capital of a guideline public company. This guideline public company produces the same set of products, or maybe a broader set of products, but nevertheless similar to the private firm. But the cost of capital is much lower. And one of the key reasons might be size. Size is a very, very important driver of capital costs. Namely, the larger the firm, the lower what's called the size premium. The smaller the firm, the larger the size premium. So cost of capital is a big issue. Second is the profit margins of these businesses. So if I looked at the profit margin of the private firm and compared it to the profit margin of the public company, and if there's a big difference, then that also will play a key role. Namely, the profit margin of the private firm being less than the profit margin of the public company, that would tend to depress the multiple that should be applied to the private firm. Therefore, using the multiple of the public company would inflate, just on that basis alone, would create an upward bias in the value. And finally, it's the expectation of earnings or cash flow. For example, the private company might have a growth rate in earnings that is a fraction, or let's say half, of the growth rate in earnings of the public company, or vice versa. So all of these factors come together to determine what the correct multiple is. And therefore, simply using an averaging process, as I said, it averages our ignorance, is simply going to be inappropriate. But coincidentally, there could be offsetting. So for an example, it might happen that a private company could have a high profit margin and a significant expected growth rate in earnings, and all of those two offset the much higher cost of capital. So the appropriate multiple for that private firm would be what the public company multiple would be. I mean, there would be no adjustment in this particular example. But that is generally not the case. That is generally not the case.
So, to summarize part one of this presentation, where we looked at the theory of using guideline public firms to determine private firm enterprise value, we showed that public guideline companies are not clones of the private firm to be valued, and therefore adjustments have to be made. Using multiples from public guideline companies directly to value private firms usually biases the value upward and leads to incorrect conclusions of value. And finally, adjustments should be quantitative and not qualitative. So in part two of this presentation, we will discuss how to make these adjustments.